Zora and Me, Chapter 12. The town of Lake Matland was a pretty busy place, even back then. Between the pine forest and the orange groves and the packing house and the ice factory and the stables, there was thousands of people living and working there. Half the people in Eatonville went there for work, like my mama. It was a fancy place, too. Maybe not as swanky as Winter Park, but folks from cold places all over, even presidents, thought it was worth the trip to spend the winter in Lake Matland. This particular Saturday the town was crawling with folks who cared about more things than I could count. A great many of them were concerned with looking sharp as tacks. Others couldn't see what was right in front of them for how busy they were trying to get where they were going. The sun was hot, but that was the least of Lake Matland's heat. The rattle of wagon wheels, the hollow clatter of horseshoes, and the rumble of an occasional automobile engine created a warmth on the ground that might as well have been baking our feet. We hopped and skipped like coal embers were grazing our toes right through our shoes. When we ran into Mrs. Eunice Jefferson in the linen store, she almost seemed jumpy, but in a different way. She had springs in her jaws. Mrs. Jefferson was in the back of the store where the towels were stacked. The shop was lovely and cool. Fabric for bed sheets was on big spools in the store window. Beaded pillows trimmed with all colors of lace lined the shelves. Some were velvet, others were silk. I wanted to touch my face to each one. I wanted to rub luxury on my skin, and I wanted a little luxury to rub off on me. I didn't know otherwise how to take any home to my mama. Zora wasn't nearly as interested in what I considered to be the store's treasures as she was in sticking her nose in grown folks' business. "A murder in Eatonville got the white folks over here awful nervous," Mrs. Jefferson whispered. "I know what gets under they skin better than most. Being in someone's house, cleaning up they slop, you can't help but get they thoughts rubbed off on you, no matter how down deep they think they got 'em locked up either. If there's one person it's hard to hide a thought from, it sure is a maid." "That ain't no kind of talk for children," Mrs. Hurston whispered back. But Mrs. Jefferson must not have heard her, because she kept on. "Course white folks don't care who it was. Not that anybody, no. He wasn't kin to anybody in these parts, or we'd have heard by now. Probably one of them turpentine workers riding a freight train and fell off like a fool," Mrs. Jefferson clucked. Mrs. Hurston leaned over and shooed us out. "Wait for me outside, you two." "But that ain't none of my business," we heard Mrs. Jefferson say, and she started in on another topic. "Now, if you want to hear something." Zora grabbed my hand and pulled me behind a large bale of fabric, where we could go on listening. Zora wasn't about to let any grown folk talk slip through her fingers. Mrs. Jefferson was off to the races. "Call herself Gold." "Gold? Now what kind of a name is that? Who called herself Gold?" Mrs. Jefferson clicked her tongue. Or maybe it was Mrs. Hurston. "But that ain't the best part. You know white folks can't see like we do," Mrs. Jefferson said. "You had to see this girl. If you would have seen her, Lucy, you couldn't have missed her. Is she that pretty?" "I guess some folks would say she is. Now, the stack of new tablecloths she left here with," Mrs. Jefferson whispered, "they sure was pretty." Mrs. Jefferson didn't stop there. "But that ain't the best part. Just yesterday I was at the butcher for the Joneses' Sunday dinner when Gold done traipsed her way in, proud as she want to be. Lucy, this girl done had a white man accompany her to the butcher. But that ain't the best part." "Then what is?" Mrs. Hurston asked, her words bubbling with curious, amused laughter. There was a pause. I guessed that Mrs. Jefferson was looking over her shoulder. Then she spoke in the loudest whisper I ever heard. "Her and the white man engaged to get married." Mrs. Hurston gasped, and Zora had finally had her fill of silence and invisibility. She popped up from behind the bale like a weasel. "What y'all talking about? Who's getting married?" Suddenly the fun was over. "What are you all doing here?" Mrs. Hurston was more irritated than angry. "Didn't I tell you both to wait for me outside?" Zora didn't have a chance to answer. The owner of the store, a white woman named Mrs. Walcott, suddenly appeared from behind the counter. "What's all this ruckus?" Her voice was sharp. "Just children, ma'am, just children," Mrs. Jefferson answered. "I'm done with Mrs. Jones picking out for the afternoon. These dish towels will be all." Mrs. Walcott also eyed the two ivory towels draped over Mrs. Hurston's arm. They looked the same to me as clouds. The way the white woman stared at them, they might as well have been. "What are those towels for?" Mrs. Hurston didn't hesitate. "I've started doing some housework for some folks here in town. They're having guests arrive tomorrow. These are for them." Zora got a strange look in her eye, but she knew better than to blurt out the truth, as her mother told the kind of lie we'd all heard plenty of times before. Eatonville's motto might as well have been, "No need for white folks to know our business. Best to let them think they got the upper hand." Since folks always called these kinds of answers white lies, Zora and I reckoned it was because white folks required lies from us. That's not to say that we thought of our business, our lives, as particularly colored or Negro. We just didn't think white people needed to be privy to anything that was ours. Our lives and ourselves weren't simply anyone's for the taking. "Well, I'll ring it all up now," Mrs. Walcott said, satisfied, and took both sets of towels to the register. Mrs. Jefferson and Mrs. Hurston followed behind her, and we followed behind them. We were all silent. When we got outside, I looked at the two women holding their packages. Mrs. Jefferson's for her employer and Mrs. Hurston's for her own household, and I couldn't see any difference between the two women. It picked at my spirit that the surest way for Negroes to get along was to pretend we were only ever running errands for white folks. Didn't people like Mrs. Walcott think anything belonged to us? But a different lie suddenly took center stage.